Greetings, Glocal citizens. It's Florence Adu, your host for the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. My next interview is coming to us in two parts. I am meeting with Egyptologist Samir Abbass. He is the owner and CEO of Real Egypt and Real Sudan tours. So please be sure to join us for both parts where we talk in depth about African civilization, as well as his journey to becoming and realizing the Africanness in his Egyptian heritage. So let's get to the interview. Hi there, Glocal citizens. It's Florence Adu, your host for the podcast that inspires a borderless mindset around doing something in the world. Hello again from Brooklyn, New York. We are in the final weeks before this monumental election that's coming up. And so I am hunkering down and doing some volunteer activities just to show my citizenship commitment to getting people out to vote and getting people to think critically about the issues. So I just put that in as an aside because I'm in the US for an extended amount of time because these times are so challenging. My guest today is in Europe. He's coming to us from Barcelona by way of Egypt. His name is Samir Abbass. He is the owner and operator of Real Egypt and Real Sudan, which are based in Cairo and Khartoum. And this is a travel services company. So they do tours, they do lectures, they do a lot of servicing for universities, for schools across the region and abroad. And he is also an environmentalist, an Egyptologist, and he has been featured on more than 60 Nile TV programs. And Nile TV is the national broadcaster in Egypt. And he has been featured as the expert on ancient Nile Valley civilization. Samir, I love your resume and welcome to Glocal Citizens. Tell us more about you. Thank you. Tell us more about you and what inspires you.
That will be a long story, but to cut the long story short. So you are talking to a Black person who was born in Egypt, in Alexandria, 47 years ago, a long time ago now, and a young boy, tall, slim, dark skin or black, in a community which is mostly of Mediterranean culture or Mediterranean blood. If you are familiar with Alexandria, Alexandria is a city in the north part of Africa, the northern part of Africa in Egypt, and it is overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. From a family origin which has come from the south of Egypt, which is near the border of Sudan. That's how I get my dark skin and my African genetics. And I grow up have no connection with Africa. Living in Egypt and Alexandria have no connection with Africa at all. Mm. If somebody like more than 20, 25 years ago will ask me about who I am, Arab, Middle Eastern, Egyptian, but the word Africa will not come to my mind at all.
Interesting.
It was a very interesting story, my transition, how I start looking at my African background. Even being born and grown up in Egypt, in Africa, which is, I haven't knew my African roots, I haven't knew my African backgrounds until I start excavating that or exploring that.
I like that word, excavating.
Yeah. So my first degree in agricultural engineering had nothing to do with what I'm doing now. And one of the very interesting facts, which is I'm not shy to tell to everybody, is in my schooling, the worst degrees I had is in English and history.
Oh, and you have to use both of those on an everyday basis. So.
Exactly. So, Arabic is my first language. English is my second language. Sure. And I was educated in a public school. And in public schooling in Egypt, in that time, so you will finish your high school and you cannot put two English words together. So it was really a big challenge. And there was the first thing happens to me, which is a culture shock. That's when I was chosen by the city hall in that time, that was over 27 or 25 years ago, to be one of the students to represent Alexandria in a big festival. Contains many people or many young people of my age at that time come from 27 different cities named after Alexander.
So is that what it was called? It was called the Alexander Festival. Is that what it was called?
It was like Alexander Festival, so which is and, and then it was a big scam, because they chose me only because I was a famous basketball player in one of the good teams of Alexandria at that time. I was known.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I didn't knew that I don't have any other communication skills like language. I don't know much about my history to talk with the people there. So I spent like 7 days, which was like torturing for me because I would like to speak with every person from different backgrounds, understand, because that for me, the world was very small before this moment. And this culture shock opens the world in front of my eye suddenly.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back home in depression after 7 days. I have to find a way to go out of this bubble, especially that in the news and the TV. First of all, the organization-wise, it was not good at all. Not
Okay.
at all. But in the news came out that it was the most and the best festival ever planned in the history of Egypt. So that was another culture shock for me because until this point, until this time, I used to believe in everything in the TV, everything in the radio, everything written up.
Interesting. Okay.
The statement, which is in the TV, kept me freeze in front of the TV, the news, the national broadcast of the news for 10 minutes. Do you know what I was trying to do in 10 minutes? I was trying to fool myself. I was trying to prove to myself that for 20 years I was right, and the news is right,
Mm-hmm.
and everything I believe in the news is right, and I wasn't focused much in this conference or in this festival to see the situation that it was a great situation, but I haven't noticed that. I missed that. For 20 years, I was trying to fool myself, to convince myself all of my heritage for 20 years is not wasted. No, that was right. And the news is right. And what I've seen myself with my eyes and my ears is not the right.
Interesting. Right. So, yeah, so that is a rude awakening.
After 10 minutes, I almost like myself. That was really a wake up call for me. So that was the turning time in my life. That's when I decided to go back to explore, like to go out of this and to question everything. It was very difficult, I don't know what to do. And I decided to go back to the school again and study history to be a tour guide. So a tour guide, I will meet people from different backgrounds. If I cannot afford traveling, at least I can take them on a tour in the city. But the question is that how they will accept me in this college, so to do a 2 years intensive programs and the history of Egypt and how condensed it is. I have to be already qualified to pass a test in order to get to these courses and get qualified. 500 candidates applied, only 50 they need, and I was one of them.
Wow. Okay.
It's not because I was smart. No, it was
because of basketball.
That was another thing which I'm not ashamed about it. So I think that I failed on almost in every exam, that's even the language exam, because my language skills was almost not existent at that time. But again, because of the college wanted a basketball team, I wanted me to lead this team. But when I started working on myself, I finished my first degree. I started working as a tour guide. The world was opening up gradually to me, like meeting people from different countries, taking them around. Then decided to move to Cairo to take another degree. That was my third degree in Egyptology. Then I knew what I'm doing, and I'm getting more into very familiar with history, with Egyptian history, Sudanese history. I graduated after 3 years as the second one in my class, and I was working at that time. And then I was already working for travel companies. And then in 2008, I said, no, that's enough. I cannot work for other companies anymore. I have a certain values, which is not about the money, but mainly about delivering a message. And I feel that my message is not being delivered or being distracted or controlled by people they would like to make more money.
Yeah.
And that's why I decided to say goodbye for travel companies gradually and built my own business. I started with Egypt and then Sudan. But before telling you how things evolved me to this stage, I need to tell you also another interesting thing about which makes the bond with Africa with me.
Okay.
So I was invited for a trip when I was living in Alexandria to go to Aswan. If you're not familiar with the map, or the audience not familiar with the map of Egypt, so Egypt in the northeast part of Africa.
Yes.
Alexandria in the very north part of Egypt, which is the very north part of Africa as well.
Yes.
Aswan in the southern part of Egypt. Aswan is ancient Egyptian record known as the gateway to Africa.
Okay.
So I was invited by the college to make this trip. And I remember when I made to Aswan, that was another a good shock for me because for some reason I felt that I belonged there, not in Alexandria. There is people in skin color.
Mm-hmm.
There is a nature and environment and weather, which is my body feels healthier in, like a hotter climate, a warmer climate.
Mm-hmm.
Even with all of my colleagues in the schools, they were complaining from the sun and the heat. For me, that was just what you're talking about.
Yes.
The Nile River comes to its most beauty. And I decided that I will graduate. I will find a house by the Nile in Aswan and live the rest of my life here. They have a good basketball team. They have tourism. I don't need anything else.
Okay.
So it was my first bond with Africa. That's how I knew my African part.
Okay. So you came to understand, by the
That's
South.
how I came to understand my African roots only when I found myself fitting in African community, which is a gateway of Egypt to the rest of the world.
Sure.
And that gave me the power to focus more on my study on that, and focus more on my tours on that. And even in 2011, when things went down in Egypt, without thinking, I went to Sudan. I spent 3 years there building itineraries, tours, exploring, and taking groups, touring them until I built a team of archaeologists, Sudanese archaeologists. They are working with me in introducing Sudan civilization now.
Wow, that's so intriguing. Just to be, and I want to get a little bit more into the process of building that business abroad, because that's, I talk a lot with people who come from a Western culture and typically build in Africa. And I love the fact that you are in an African culture and building in another African culture, which is quite different from your original standpoint. So first, let me take a step back and do my why the where question, because you've kind of touched on that. But right now I'm talking to you from Barcelona. So this is my question for now. I mean, first of all, where are you local? And then why the where? So how did you come to be living, working, and playing where you currently are?
Okay, so first of all, I like so much the name of your show, which is Glocal Citizen. That was a new expression for me. I started searching and trying to find what really, I found that this expression fits in me now.
Yes, wonderful.
So I grew up in Alexandria. I moved to Cairo. Then I moved to Khartoum in Sudan. And then also I explored Ethiopia and many other African countries, total number of European countries, total number of countries, which is over 25 countries, that they are increasing now. Mm-hmm. And the more I travel, the more I respect and the more I value more my African roots. Mm-hmm. So my story with Barcelona started only less than 3 months ago or 4 months ago.
Okay.
So I am a new here.
Okay.
And after I finished my degrees and became more focused on Nile Valley civilization, Egyptology, Kushite, Nubian, and Egyptian civilization as an African civilization, I figured out that it is a time to understand this African civilization in a broader scale. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm doing a master in world history in Barcelona. Okay. That's why I decided to go to Barcelona. And I'm very happy actually because the university, which is UPF University, is a very good university. And I'm not being upset with the classes so far. And that's also opening the doors wider for me to understand Africans' rules and African civilization rules in a broader perspective.
Yeah, I get it. Now, you said UPF. What does that stand for?
It's UPF. Let me check.
Oh, it's a Spanish acronym. Okay. All right. So I'll get that from you and add it to the show notes.
Something fabric, that it's, yeah.
Okay. So we'll have that in the show notes. Okay, interesting. So just to spread your wings further and broader perspective, I get that. Okay, so taking another step in a different direction, I'm curious about how growing up, you mentioned that you never had a sense of your Africanness, but your mother, you mentioned, is from Sudan or has more of the African background. Your father has more of the Middle Eastern background. So how did they come together?
The other way around.
The other way around. Okay, so it's father that is the African roots and the mother is the Middle Eastern roots. So how did they come together? How did they come together to find each other and create this Egyptologist we're speaking with now?
That's a very common story which just happens in Egypt a lot. And it's still happening until today. Unfortunately, in the southern part of Egypt is not as well developed and receiving the proper attention like the north part of Egypt.
Okay, so it's migration.
Most of the governments, most of the wealth and the money in the north part. And after that, there was one of the biggest drama happened in the modern history with building the old dam in Aswan and the high dam to the south of Aswan, causing literally flooding houses and villages of over 100,000 Nubians. Has to relocate themselves from their villages, which became under the water now, their fields, their trees, and their temples, and their entire civilization, and have to find another place.
Okay.
So that was a big waves of immigrations happens in Egypt in the 1960s and 1970s. That's when my grandfather did his step and he decided to move to Alexandria, to the farthest north of Egypt. And they were living a very humble life in that time. And that's when my father was being born, a very poor family. And they were living literally in a rooftop, in a small room on a rooftop of a building. The interesting thing that the building in front of them that was owned by a kind of an upper middle class family of Alexandria at that time, which is coming from Mediterranean background. And my father, he started working for my grandfather from my mother's side, which is our Mediterranean blood and backgrounds. And then he was impressed with how hard workers and how smart, because my father, he educated himself, like from scratch until he finished the schooling and colleges as well. And he was working and studying at the same time. And when my mother needed classes like to improve her academic in the high school, my father voluntarily, you can raise all of your fingers, do that, and that's how the connection. But these marriages, it was very uncommon to happen in that time.
Right. That's why I asked that question, because I know that there's similar to men, just the global South and many countries, we have the same thing. And I'm not surprised that Southern Egypt is less developed than Northern Egypt. And the closer you are to lighter skin, there are definitely more opportunities available, more infrastructure available, more of everything. So I see you're the classic migration story, opportunities for economic growth. So let me ask you this question, which is our Glocal Speak question. This is where I ask what you hear. So not necessarily where you are in Barcelona, but what I'm interested in you sharing a word or phrase or saying that is a meaningful part of your local experience and why or how you came to value it as Glocal Speak. So considering you've only been in Spain for a short time, maybe it's not something from Spain, but maybe it's something from your experience in Sudan or in Egypt or any other country that you've experienced.
So can you rephrase your question again, just to make sure that
Yes. So the Glocal Speak is what you hear. So something that sticks with you that you've taken along your journey as a reminder or as something meaningful and in the way that people communicate from other places where you've been local.
Okay, so something which is other words, like something to connect me while here with Africa, something which is I speak with when it comes with for being here to reminds me and to connect me with Africa. That's like your question?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I have almost half of my time is still while here in Barcelona. Every day is consumed in conversations with people in Egypt and Sudan.
Okay.
So that's to keep up my business. It was, the good news that I managed to survive the COVID so far.
Yes, congratulations. Yeah.
And we start receiving some requests, which is good enough to move things around and in the process of developing things as well. So here in Barcelona, I'm still new. I haven't explored that much. I'm still much into studies, the language study, the academic, and also like telework. But I know that there is a kind of a space here for people to express their views.
Yes.
Unlike the places where I came from.
Right. Yeah.
And I highly respect that, even which is a surprise thing for me, that there is some people complaining that they don't have enough space to express themselves, which is, I would like to invite them to go to some countries in Africa and see the difference.
Exactly.
And also, I traveled in different places in Spain, actually. This is not my first visit to Spain. I came here for a short visit in January. I found that there is a passion for the people here to learn about Africa and to learn about Egypt as well. And I found also that the word, just mentioning the word Africa, Egypt as part of Africa, makes people like there is a big gap in people knowledge about Africa, and there's a deep interest to learn about that. The big problem is the travel business is very much corrupted and controlled by mega companies, big corporations, which is selling very cheap. I'm not talking about cheap price, but cheap ideas.
Yeah.
They are not selling experiences. They are selling just highlights. They are taking people, putting them, jamming on a bus, and they're taking them to see just highlights without even giving the proper explanation.
Right. No depth. Yeah.
Exactly. So the people which is ending traveling to Egypt as one of the destination of Africa or North Africa, and they don't have the chance to learn the history in a proper way. Not only hardly anybody from Europe, and especially from Spain, they make it to the heart of Africa.
Right.
So Africa for them is the north part, which they can easily, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and the southern part, which is Cape Town and
Exactly. Everything in the middle is like
real Africa lies in between.
Yes, exactly.
Most of the people, they don't have any knowledge about it. Even when I talk with people about Sudan, they get shocked. Sudan? Is there Israelis? There's people going to Sudan? Why? What in Sudan, actually, for people to see? When I tell them that in Sudan there are 3 times more pyramids in numbers than the pyramids of Egypt, which is the most famous thing in Egypt, they get shocked.
Yeah.
They don't believe it.
Right. So just putting it back in context about the Glocal Speak. So what kind of word would you describe as something that's very common in your experience in giving tours, specifically in Egypt? So something that you often end up, telling people as like in their travel, like, oh, when you're here, this is something that you'll hear often. So know that this means that.
So I will tell you like a story, because I organized like many tours for African Americans. They are visiting Egypt and Sudan, searching for the roots. And I remember that in one of the lectures, which is I give a lecture in Aswan, and I give a lecture about Egyptian civilization as an African civilization. And I talked with them about a henge, which is like the Stonehenge, the famous one in England, which is was about it. And I talked about this henge, which is 3,000 years at least older than the one in England.
Yes, of course.
And I was doing this lecture in a hotel in Aswan in that time, and I told them this Stonehenge is only 15 minutes drive or 30 minutes walking distance from you here. Have you heard about it? They haven't heard about it. So that was a big shock for them. And I remember that they were leaving the following day in the early morning in a flight. They decided after the lecture to give up their dinner
to go.
So they go and see the Stonehenge, which is nobody talks about it.
Sure. Exactly.
So these are the kind of things which I talked about when it comes to Egypt and Sudan. Because Egypt itself is not introduced to the world as an African civilization.
Sure.
And that is the first thing I would like to focus on it.
Got it. Yes.
Why Egypt was stripped out from its African roots, and why Egypt? What is the proof that Egypt is an African civilization? For a proof, there is like hundreds of proofs. Just being situated in Africa, that's one of the strongest proof itself. Actually, to say that it is not African, that's a very weird assumption, which does need to be
sure.
But one of the very interesting facts is that how the Egyptian civilization has been introduced to the world by Africans, not by Egyptians. It was by many Europeans' colony. The move to Egypt started by the French, that was in the 18th century, for the Suez Canal to connect the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and part of their historical fight with England.
Yep.
And that's why the England or the British England, they like jumped into Egypt after that. So when the French came to Egypt, they were surprised. They've seen things they haven't seen it before, and it was not known before.
Mm-hmm.
And when they've seen the pyramids, and when the British colony, when they've seen the pyramid, the Sphinx, and the temples, and that was the same time. That's when that was the peak of the slave trade.
Right.
And the main source of the slaves that was coming from Africa, young, hard workers, which is needed in another colony in Latin America.
Aha.
The sugarcane cultivations and tobacco plantations, and in the US as well, in the cotton plantations and tobacco plantations,
Right.
because almost the half of the native population, like native Indians or native people there, has been died because of diseases, after the colony, and because of also some other problems in North America. So they needed the slave.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest source for slaves, that was from Africa.
Yes.
And, to convince a person like you and me, but with a different skin color, that he can hire, or he cannot hire, he can buy, he can purchase a human being with arms and legs and eyes and nose like him, but the difference that is in different color, and treat them like an animal farms, that was a problem they have to deal with, and they have to convince the white people, which is they were in control in that time, that those people, they are not true human. They are half human, half beast. They might be like, looks like us, but they don't have the human soul. Or they are not fully evolved, a human being. They're still like a stage between the apes, monkey, and a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there was hundreds of theories, and that was almost convinced everybody that in a state that Africans sometimes displayed in a zoo in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So think about in the middle of that, when pyramids in Egypt, which is built 4,500 years ago, nobody until now knew the sophistication knowledge, how it was built back in that time.
Right.
So that is completely turning their theories upside down. Because it doesn't make sense that people which is not evolved yet, and we are much more superior than them, 4,500 years before us, when we were still living in caves, they were very sophisticated and had that much knowledge and civilization to build this sophisticated civilization.
Right.
And that's why they decided in that time to strip Egypt from its African root. They cannot cover up the pyramids. They cannot cover up. So we have to create another theory. And this theory is not only started by the British colony, by the way, is as early as Herodotus. If you are Herodotus, Greek historian from the 5th century BC, he traveled to Egypt. And you know what is his first comments about the pyramids when he sees the pyramids? Because he think that Greek is the highest civilization of all this.
Exactly. Right.
Once he seen these African pyramids standing in front of him, he said, "This pyramid is built by slaves." And he said also that it was all of his book about the pyramids, or in his guidebook, it's mainly about to demonize and to humble the pyramids of Africa.
Yes, to make them meaningless. Mm-hmm.
So he said that, so the King Khufu, the owner of the Great Pyramid, he was running out of money. And when his daughter realized that his father, he cannot finish his project, the daughter of the king herself decided to work in a brothel as a prostitute to raise funds for her father. And she was greeted by a bonus. By every man had a relation with her with a stone block. That's how she built her own pyramid.
Wow. And people believed it. That's so deep, because it's more than just about, that these Africans couldn't do it. Is that this woman was a whore. So now we have the African woman as an eternal whore.
So it was very interesting. So they want to promote, or they want the people to believe that the pyramids built, I'm using the pyramids as a symbol for the African civilization.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is not the only one. There is 100 other civilizations, but as a pyramid, as an example. So it was built from a prostitute money. It was built by slaves. It was built by the Israelites. It was built by the aliens. It was built by the people of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
All these theories, they are the most common theories now about the pyramids.
Sure.
But
the truth.
Not for Africans.
Yes. Yeah. No truth. The basic truth is just washed away. Yeah. So I get it. Yeah. I absolutely get it. So I love that your Glocal Speak is just spreading the gospel that Africans in Africa is more than what Europe and the West truly understand it to be. So there's so much more depth, which is the evolution of your company. So you mentioned, how you kind of eased your way into the travel business, but tell us more about your academics and how you came to be an expert in Egyptology beyond just your studies, but also in your experiences traveling around and how you got to really understand the history and use it to build your businesses.
So I feel that my mind is like pulled into two parts.
Mm-hmm.
Business on one side
Mm-hmm.
and academic on one side. And
Sure.
normally those are not mixed. Normally
It's
they are
true.
not mixed.
It's true.
And that's why myself I'm trying to solve this confusion like sooner or later. So having the business, for me, I'm not a businessman. So by the way, Real Egypt is number one on TripAdvisor, which is the most important travel site.
Yes, exactly.
Real Plan is number one on TripAdvisor too. And Real Egypt was on Lonely Planet, which is mentioned among like only one of 4 companies in Lonely Planets. And there is like 3,000 companies in Egypt.
Yeah.
But myself, I refuse to introduce myself as a businessman.
Okay.
So it's not about the money which drives me. It is the message I would like to deliver and the quality of what I would like to deliver. I enjoy the process. I enjoy talking to people. Until now, I hire and train people to do the administrative work, which is I know how to do it well, in order to give myself the time to communicate with people, to answer their emails and take them in tours as well.
Yeah.
And when I choose a degree to do, I didn't choose a business like my business advisor. He advised me I have to do a management degree. I said, no, that will shift me away completely from, I choose another degree in history. So,
okay.
And it was not easy, to be honest. It was not easy, like time-wise. But on the other hand, it was not complicated because I was not focused on the business and the money. I was focused more on the value I can give it.
Sure.
One of the things I tried that I don't put any money for marketing at all.
Okay. So word of mouth is everything.
I take people around. I have over 100 person now in my team. They are in Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia. And I choose them very well, which is to have the same background and the same mentality, the same concept.
Sure.
To treat people as guests. To believe that in their role is not to lead a tour, but to deliver a message and to help people understand. And that's how I grow. And that's how I managed to mix both of them together.
Okay. So take us on one of your most popular tours. What does the tour entail?
Okay. So there is one tour which is I put Egypt and Sudan together.
Okay.
And that is one of my favorite tours. I start from Cairo, which is the main airport. People come to the airport. And I take them not to Giza Pyramid, it was a great pyramid first. I take them to Saqqara Pyramid. I take them to Maidun Pyramid. I take them to the Bent Pyramid in Dashur. Then the following day, I take them to Giza Pyramid. Why? When you bring people from a European backgrounds, from Western backgrounds, and which is their civilization, which is the oldest one of them is like 2,000 years old. When you put them in front of a very sophisticated, one of the greatest, biggest building on earth, 4,500 years ago, they cannot understand it. Their mind, we fail to understand the concept that could be a human being built it back in that time. And that's why I take them in transition. I show them the first pyramid built by the African Egyptians. I show them many of the tries and errors, which is made by the Egyptians in that time, which is among them the collapsed pyramids in Maidum. And the bent pyramid, when they screw up halfway and they couldn't finish the pyramid right and became like an bent looking. And I tell them the history of 200 years of suffering and learning until they managed to build a great pyramid.
Right.
Then I fly them to Luxor.
Okay.
And I show them more into, because we are getting to the south, more deep into Africa now.
Yes.
I show them the Valley of the Kings, the big temples, Karnak and Luxor, and I take them to tombs, which is showing the ancient Egyptian, how they looks like, not only kings, also individuals, with their body style, slim body, a dark skin, black, brown, ridged skin, with the features, which is very much like what is the Africans looks like today. And I tell them that was the ancient Egyptians. The people you are seeing today, in Cairo and Alexandria, in north of Egypt, they are like, on North Africa, they are a melting pot.
Right. All immigration, yeah.
Then I put them in a boat. I choose not the big engine cruise boat, like a smaller version called the Dahabiya, which is with sail. and I make them sailing the Nile River, exactly like the ancient Egyptian did,
Sure.
in cabins, with meals and with toilets and showers and everything, but putting them in a sailboat and not only stopping on archaeological sites like the big cruise. No, we stop in villages and go and see people, how they live, how
Uh-huh.
the African culture is still in everyday life,
Sure.
and then arriving in Aswan, which is the highest African experience in Egypt,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
taking them to see the Stonehenge, make them feeling proud,
Mm-hmm.
showing them how 3,000 years before the English one, we have
The
our,
same technology. Yeah. Is it called Stonehenge in Egypt as well?
we call that Nabta Playa henge.
Nabta Playa Henge.
And there, because this henge is nearly 2,000 years or 3,000 years prior to the pyramids,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is you're talking about 7,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And which means that the pyramids was like a peak. It wasn't a start. It was a peak. The civilization already started in Africa 2,000 years before.
Right.
7,000 years, actually starting only from the henge, the Nabta Playa.
Mhm.
And before, to reach the henge, we have another 3,000 years of unrecorded civilization. So we are talking about 10,000 years of
Yes.
civilization. Then from Aswan to Abu Simbel, crossing the border to Sudan and hugging the Nile River and traveling on roads, on off roads along the Nile River, deeper in Africa, and see gradually how the African effects is getting higher and how nations merge and influence each other, and they grow with each other back in that time, influencing both sides until we make it to Khartoum and then the National Museum. We stop at Marawi site, for example. In Marawi, it's the biggest pyramid field ever in the whole world. 100 pyramid in one field in Marawi. That is in Sudan. I take them through Abu Simbel in the southern part of Egypt by the border, and also in Karima, with Jabal Barkan in Sudan. Both dedicated for gods in ancient Egypt. They were known as God Amun. And both considered a brainwashing machine. I call them a brainwashing machine of how civilizations back in that time, African civilizations, they were clashing and trying to influence each other.
Yes, exactly. So to put it in context, was Sudan, the Sudan that you're taking on the tour, was that Sudan or Nubia, or was it Egypt?
That was a very good question. So you threw up like Sudan, Egypt, and Nubia. So first of all, we need to explain to our audience what is Nubia. So Nubia means, as the word means, gold. It was named in that name by the Romans and by the ancient Egyptians, actually, even before that, by the ancient Egyptians, because that was a source of gold.
Got it.
So there is a plenty of resources of Africa that's became one of the biggest, I will say, setbacks, but one of the biggest enemies of Africa itself.
Yes.
So Nubia lies between south of modern Egypt today, which is in Aswan, until north of Khartoum today.
Okay.
And this area known as the Nubian lands, which is people have different culture, different traditions. They have been defined by the word Nubians or the land of gold. So there is also another term, which is Kosh. Kosh also another term to the Sudanese civilization, which is they were in clash from time to another with the Northern civilization in Egypt, and which is both of them African, but they were, because of the borders and because of fighting on resources, sometimes they were sometimes in clash with each other. So that was just to draw alliance between what is Nubians, ancient Egyptian, but the interesting thing, that's why I like Stonehenge, like Nabta Playa. The interesting thing that's another story and I hear different lectures about the Stonehenge, and there is an ongoing fight since it was discovered because it's still something new. So the Sudanese saying that it is a Sudanese, it is ours. It is an Egyptian territory now, okay? More specific, 120 kilometers to the west of Abu Simbel, southwest Egypt. And the Egyptian, they said, no, it is in our lands, that's ours. The Nubians saying that is our territory. We don't have lands, but at least we deserve that is to be ours.
Okay.
So the fact that in the time when the Stonehenge emerged or made or built or erected, better to say erected, the Nabta Playa, henge, there was no Egypt, there was no Sudan, there was no Kosh, there was no Nubia. They were all Africans. They were all Africans coming from the same race, from the same backgrounds. And after that, they start being divided into Egyptians, Koshites, Nubians. All of them inherited this one civilization, which is rooted in Africa, born in Africa, The Stonehenge or the Henge of Nabtabla is a symbol of that. And then they spread and they start to improving this civilization in different territories.
Sure. Yep. I get. So that then puts some framework around your Nile Valley civilization studies. Exactly. Or expertise. Yeah.
The thing which just connects all that together.
Thanks for joining us this week for Glocal Citizens. Please do join us for part 2 of my conversation with Samir Abbass next week. As always, you can find us at glocalcitizenspod.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you can find us. So please do join. There are great show notes for this episode, so please do check us out on the website and also wherever you find your podcast. Subscribe, share, drop us a line. Just let us know you're out there. Thanks again for joining. Bye for now.